This is a fully playable plastic miniature ship for tabletop games. Behind me is the Vasa ship, 226 foot, built in the 1620s. At its time, one of the most powerfully armed military ships around. It was also beautifully painted. Can I paint this ship like that ship? That's a big box. It's a ye olde letter. Oh, it's from Archon Studios, the sponsors of this video. Welcome to Dungeons and Lasers Port Haven, a bustling port city renowned for its lively tavern music, ship crews and treasures and probably pirates, and a massive playable 70-centimeter ship. Now there's plenty of details here about the entire campaign, but I really want to just paint that big ship and try and go for something colorful like I've seen on the Vasa. But also just, how do we get it on the table in a decent amount of time? Maybe some shortcuts on how to paint some decent wood, stuff like that. And so let's get this massive ship assembled, as well as get some more inspiration from the mighty Vasa. Archon Studios make hard plastic miniatures and terrain, and the same goes for this Dungeons and Lasers campaign. Details are crisp and everything is rather durable. All the bits come on sprue and requires assembly. I use plastic cement or superglue, kind of depending on how fast I want to move on or how the bits can be assembled. This ship is what you would call an extravagant environment for gameplay, not a historical model. Games like Dungeons and Dragons or tabletop war games are played on it and in it for storytelling and gameplay extravaganza. A fantasy model, if you will. Yet it's surprisingly alike the Vasa. As many masts and a similar look, maybe it's just the ye olde look. The Vasa, however, was no fantasy pirate ship. Commissioned by the King of Sweden, Vasa was to be the embodiment of the might of the Swedish, a terror of the seas with immense firepower, a symbol of the ambitions of the Swedish king. Built from more than 1,000 oak trees, and it's quite the sight. The Vasa was fantastically adorned with wooden sculptures, almost to the point where one would be excused to be thinking that the real, big, historical landmark ship is indeed something out of the fantasy realm. All of it's symbolic, mythical beasts, heroes, enemies, and regular people. Propaganda and storytelling. Unfortunately, the Vasa sank, about 1,000 meters from where it was launched. Bummer that. I gather the king was not pleased. If you want to know what happened in detail, a visit to the Vasa Museum is one of the must-dos while visiting Stockholm. However, because it sank, it was preserved, and that's why we have it with us still. It is rather brown though, kind of like my plastic bits. This was not always the case though. On launch day, it was quite the color splash. These are recreations of some of the sculptures ornamenting the Vasa ship. Based on analysis of paint and pigments and residues, science has been able to recreate the striking color schemes of old. It's kind of difficult to fathom the color intensity. My perceived image of ye olden days is a muted idea, not the rather psychedelic spectacle I see here, a far cry from Pirates of the Caribbean gimmicks imprinted on my retina. This is one of my favorites. This is a person from Poland. And the Swedish were fighting the Polish, and so they made this cowardly-looking Polish guy and put him up in the toilets, so the crew could just watch the very cowardly Polish guy while they were, taking a dump. It's kind of fun. Now, we probably should not dwell on the fact that the makers of this great plastic kit are in fact Polish. Now, the ship was kind of turning out a lot larger than I thought. I tend to paint miniatures that are about 3 centimeters tall. This ship has several stories that fit miniatures of that size tall. If you're smart, you can probably so-called sub-assembly this ship even more than I did to simplify painting. But I definitely think that any wise person would leave the masts removable and not glue them in place. So the Vasa ship would have sailed out here in these waters for a brief moment. But if we look at the museum, they've actually got masts put up to represent the actual height of the masts of the Vasa ship. Feels like it would have been a pretty impressive sight. And the masts of my miniature turn out to be about 50 centimeters tall. It's probably scale accurate, but still, it's all slightly overwhelming, I guess, in a good way. Now, I won't be able to give the Vasa justice in terms of color, but I can take on inspiration and apply my own fantasy style as well as while working in broader strokes. This is not a model I wish to spend years on, rather get it just right for playing games on. More color for the people, even if they be RPG playing landlubbers. Now this is a model. This is a 1/10 scale of the Vasa, built in wood and painted like we think it was painted back in the day. And so here we can really see all the colors and adornments, and it's just really beautiful. I do have some ideas of colors to pick from this collage of sculptures at the stern of the ship, but first we should pay attention to the wood. The ship is, after all, mostly wood. I love the lighter oak look of the model of the Vasa and want to strive for something similar. The sculpting in the plastic is detailed and crisp, something I'd like to take advantage of, and I have a plan. I start by priming everything with an almost white rattle can spray. This is a brain matter beige from Army Painter. I want to proceed to tint this almost white with a thin, transparent paint that not only tints the surface, but also pulls up in the crevices, something we would call a wash. As the size of the ship is large, I also have economics in mind. Paint is expensive, and trust me, something this size will eat paint. So I decide to make an oil wash. That's mixing white spirit with oil paint about 10 times solvent to paint. I choose a rather transparent pigment as base that mixed with white spirit will have a very fluid nature. The solvent mixed with paint will find its way into all the little crevices. And a little oil paint will go a long way. Economics, see. You might be asking, I can kind of hear you, about that mentioned oak color being nice. But that right there, my friend, is a purple. And indeed it is, you're paying attention. But this is a two-step plan. This purple is the foundation for more paints to come. I'm afraid the large wooden surfaces will become boring fast without slight variations. Yet detailed painting, like brush stroke by brush stroke variations, would be a massive undertaking. This varied tinting of the surface with the purple underneath a yet-to-come transparent brown paint will make everything come alive. The lovely darker pooling in the crevices will also help with contrast and detail enhancements. Purple will be explained further on, but in the grand scheme of things, colour is more fun than grey or black. And well, purple is a colour fit for kings, right? When all the sections are covered and the paint is dried to the touch, probably 30 minutes or so after application, I go in with a sponge dampened in white spirit to smooth out any puddles or overly grained textures by gently rubbing the surface. Be careful here, the white spirit does not dissolve the base coat, but the friction of the rubbing might. I then let the oil paint cure over the weekend. Remember now, if you use solvent-based mixes like an oil wash, make sure to keep up a good ventilation and, like me, use a respirator. Now, once this is cured, I can tint the lovely surface into a brown. I do a few tests, but the theory here is that a yellowish brown mixed with a little purple will make a warm dark brown. The more purple, the darker the brown. And so adding a transparent yellow brown on top of this purple stained wood grain will give us darker brown in the crevices where the purple is predominant, plus a variation in the lighter brown shades on the other surfaces corresponding with the intensity of the purple staining. A very living surface. Transparent acrylic paints can be contrast paints, inks, stuff like that. I'm predominantly going to use these transparent art paints, high flow paints from Golden. A bit highbrow perhaps, but it's actually a little of the opposite. Again, economics tip the scales. There is a lot of ship to cover, and even though these paints are high-grade artist paints, they prove cheaper by the milliliter than miniature-specific paints like contrast paints. The only downside is that they're very glossy, a problem I solved by adding ultramatte varnish to the mix. The varnish also acts like a paint diluter, giving me a slightly more transparent paint, which is just what I need. I experiment my way to a mix of yellow iron oxide and brown iron oxide with a dash of burnt umber ink, and I brush on with a relatively large brush. I do have an airbrush, but I'm applying with a regular brush for two reasons. One is that the pooling up of paint will add to the variation. Secondly, I want to show all you brigands out there without an airbrush that this wood paint recipe works just fine without an airbrush. Now I just love how the purple comes through here and there to contrast the pale brown, how the grains in the wood get that extra punch and liveliness. And I'm a bit smug once the paint is dry and it kind of looks like I've got a wooden ship in my hands and not a plastic one. I painted the masts in a more sort of reddish-brown tint for variation, and some of the rope details in more of a neutral brown. In the end, just making sure that all parts of the ship are covered in one brown or the other. And now we can start to imagine colour. There's a lovely collection of pigments displayed at the Vasa Museum that struck my eye, based on analysis of the wooden elements as well as original documents or receipts, if you will, from the docks where the ship was built, and we have a pretty good picture of what colours or pigments were used at the time. Now we won't be able to paint hundreds of little statues in endless variation and detail with all these different colours. Instead, I'm going for a, vibe. As I'm no historian, the wording is acceptable. The base colour of the painted parts of the Vasa were red, and will do the same. After that, I want a greenish turquoise, a blue, and gold. Gold because it signals wealth and thus status, apparently all you need to rule the world, not only then, but also now. How each of us interpret inspiration is different. I'm not very literal. I don't need to copy. My takeaway is that colour can be used, and the choice of pigments or colours. This I can then apply to what I've got at hand, balancing time with the expected use I'll get out of the model and the visual impact on the gaming table. You'll notice that my painting is in fact rather simple and rather efficient, yet the sheer size of the ship means a fair bit of time is spent on even just the simplest techniques. Something to consider when painting large things for gameplay. We play for fun. I plan to continue with the use of transparent paints, but we'll also come to a final touch of opaque paints. But before that, the transparent red and the transparent blues. The look will become coherent because the red and the greenish turquoise and the blue will be filtered by the warm wooden tones underneath because of the paint transparency. The end result might be perceived as stained wood, and I kind of like that. It's also more forgiving to paint with transparent paints, especially paints like these high-flow paints or contrast-style paints. They flow out in a way that regular opaque paints don't, and this speeds up the workflow considerably. I want to mention that the model I'm painting is indeed a pre-production model. The GameFound crowdfunding campaign final version might have some slight alterations or improvements from what you see in this video. And there's of course also more details like furniture, barrels, bunks, chests. The Vasa was indeed like a small floating village, housing not only crew but also soldiers for boarding actions, with a lot of barrels. But I guess everyone needed to eat, barreled food, and gunpowder needed to be stored. As a foundation for some metallic paints to come, I use some black and dark grey contrast paints for steel and a warm brown as foundation for gold. Now, how far one wants to take the detailed painting is of course up to one and all. But I'd say if you get yourself a ship of this size, maybe get it as fast as possible to a passable gaming state, and then keep redefining details as time goes by if you feel like it, even if you've already started using it in games. Now I hope that the two-step workflow of tinting surfaces with transparent paints before moving on to opaque paints will reveal itself as a smart move. We're about to see. By brushing on some gold on the raised areas, I get two treats. One, the brown in the recesses just looks like gold in shadow, creating a mirage of depth and excitement. Two, I don't have to pay any attention to an even application of the gold paint. Just touching whatever raised areas I can reach without smudging paint on surrounding non-gold areas is enough. Same goes for the silver. My non-perfect application of steel paint actually enhances the look of steel bits on the ship, rendering a more used and scratched look. And no swearing about smudged metallic paint in the wrong places. And now we finally get that look at the result of the step-by-step process. Going for a workflow that is intended to result in a good final outcome and not immediate satisfaction can result in a bit of an uninspiring workflow. But I'm convinced this is a great way of getting things done, said the pirate to the man on the plank. And now it's time to give the blue and the turquoise a boost as well. The intention is the same as with the metallic paint, but I will use a different way of application. Diluting paint with a bit of water, I then grab a sponge. This is from a piece of packaging. You could also use a kitchen type sponge or similar. I dip the sponge in paint and make sure it's not overflowing. I want the result of a stamp. Stamping on colored sponge shaped texture. Several reasons for this. One is that it's actually rather swift. Two, it's random and natural looking. After a few passes of diluted paint, the surface looks slightly worn or hand painted at a miniature scale. 3. When the sponge is not pressed down too hard, it will only stamp paint on the raised areas, leaving the darker, more muted base colors in the recesses, resulting in depth and contrast. For some of the finer details, I resort to a smaller piece of sponge that I will hold on to with a set of tweezers. Another option is to glue a little piece of sponge to an old brush handle or similar. The masts get a sponging as well. The base color here is rather smudgy due to the lack of engraved detail. Airbrush application of paint would have been the way to go here, but I sponge on wherever the base layer looks too smudgy, and that sponging goes a long way. A lot of the time I feel painting miniatures is about figuring out the best way of hiding past sins. This is where we could say we're done. I'd normally do some weathering, something I'm a big fan of. That means essentially making the model look like it's been used and it's been out in the weather, so to speak. But I'm going to leave that for another day. Maybe this ship has a future as a moss-covered wreck guarded by ghosts of dead sailors, who knows? But there are two refinements I just can't resist. Both are rather simple. I was personally affronted by the new and shiny gold look. The blue and turquoise railings look a little worn, like this ship has sailed the seas a bit more than the Vasa ever got to do. So I want to tarnish the gold a little. For this, I use a Caucasian flesh tone wash, a warm red-brown that tints and gives the gold a slightly more vintage look. Lastly, I want to add shadows, and I'll do this with my airbrush. I could brush on effects like this. You can see examples of that in the video where I made a scratch-built lighthouse. Quite the nautical theme, rather fitting. But now, I'm very much feeling like I've proven the point that all you out there without an airbrush can still paint a ship like this well and efficiently. However, I kind of want to get to use some of my toys now. I spray a transparent grey where I imagine there would be a shadow if this ship was out in the harbour on a cloudy day. Down towards the waterline, where angles meet, under the stairs, between decks, and so on. This will give a dimensional pop, a sense of realism, yet at the same time a more painterly look. A look that says we knew what we were doing all along. I know what you've been thinking for some time now. Where are the cannons? And indeed, of course, there are cannons, not as feistily armed as the Vasa that sported the largest concentration of artillery in a single warship in the Baltic at the time, perhaps in all of Northern Europe, not because of the size of the ship or the amount of cannons, but based on the combined weight of shot. 588 pounds or 267 kilos could be fired from each side. If it hadn't sunk, that is. I take it cannons don't float very well after all. And I'm kind of glad I did not have that many cannons to paint, honestly. And of course there's hatches in the hull, and these can be glued on open if you choose, but I kind of changed my mind and just clicked them in place without glue so that in the future I can choose between open or closed hatches. Painted gold, of course, so that the last thing you see before the cannonball chops your mast off is a glint of heaven behind the smokes of hell. And that, my friends, is the end of this epic journey on the seas. I hope you're enjoying the result. I know I enjoyed both the journey and the result. I don't think we have a copy of the Vasa, but I would never have considered the rather colourful option if it hadn't been for that old and mighty ship. Nor the rather pale oak planking either, and that's thanks to that lovely model. Thank you very much to the Vasa Museum for helping me out and for letting me film at the museum. The Vasa Museum is most definitely worth a visit if you ever visit Stockholm. And I have to say that this model, my centerpiece ship, is only one part of the Grand Porthaven campaign by Dungeons & Lasers. There's a full port as well, with a tavern, a bazaar, models for crew, and all the various miniatures you'll need to play some rather epic adventures, all 5e compatible. Please do check out the GameFound campaign link down below in the description to just see it all. Everything is made out of hard plastic like we're used to from companies like Games Workshop. I was sent a few models, pre-production models as well, this huge demon or something, as well as some of the ship's crew, and it all looks very promising. I may have to mention the enticing rumour of a clear plastic ship option for those of the ghostly persuasion. And if you head over to the GameFound campaign page, there is a free model involved if you follow the campaign. A thank you to Dungeons & Lasers and to Archon Studios for sponsoring this video. And thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and for weekly live content, just look me up on Twitch. And for pledging support, have a look at my Patreon. I'll see you in the next video or out on the high seas. Bye.